When I turned onto my street after a 12-hour shift, I thought my GPS had made a mistake. A brand new 6-foot wooden fence stretched straight across my driveway, completely blocking access to my garage. My neighbor, standing on the other side with his arms crossed, looked me dead in the eyes and smiled. "Try driving home now," he said. I laughed because I honestly thought it had to be some misunderstanding. But then he calmly pulled out paperwork and claimed half of my driveway had always belonged to him. The police arrived, looked at both of us, and called it a civil dispute. They couldn't make him remove the fence. For 3 miserable weeks, I parked blocks away while he waved every morning as if he'd already won. Then one quiet afternoon, a county survey truck rolled onto our street. An older surveyor stepped out carrying weathered maps older than either of our houses. He studied one tiny brass property marker buried beneath years of dirt, smiled, and quietly asked my neighbor one question that drained every bit of confidence from his face. What happened over the next 48 hours didn't just remove a fence. It completely changed who actually owned the land everyone thought they understood. My name is Ethan Parker. I'm 34 years old, and for the past 9 years I've worked as a civil engineer in Columbus, Ohio. Most days, I spend my time solving infrastructure problems that make perfect sense on paper. Roads follow plans. Bridges follow measurements. Property lines follow legal surveys. Or at least, that's what I believed until one Thursday evening changed everything I thought I knew about neighbors. I bought my house 6 years earlier after saving nearly every bonus I earned. It wasn't the biggest home on the street, but had something I'd always wanted: a long concrete driveway leading to a detached garage where I restored old motorcycles on weekends. It was my favorite part of the property. My neighbor, Richard Dawson, moved in about 18 months after I did. At first, he seemed friendly enough. We'd wave while mowing our lawns, exchange quick conversations about weather, and occasionally collect each other's mail during vacations. But over time, little disagreements began piling up. He complained about leaves blowing into his yard, even during calm weather. He insisted one of my flower beds extended too close to what he called our shared boundary. None of it ever became serious, so I ignored it. Until that Thursday. After finishing a 12-hour inspection at a highway construction site, I turned on a Maple Ridge Drive expecting nothing more exciting than reheating leftovers and watching a baseball game. Instead, my headlights landed on something that made me slam my brakes. A brand new wooden privacy fence stretched completely across the entrance to my driveway. Fresh cedar boards, new concrete posts, metal brackets still shining in the evening sun. For several seconds, I honestly believed construction crews had made some unbelievable mistake. Then I saw Richard. He stood in his front yard holding a coffee mug, smiling like he'd been waiting all day for this exact moment. I stepped out of my truck. "Richard," I called. "What's going on?" He walked toward the fence without the slightest hint of concern. "I finally fixed the property line problem." I stared at him. "You built a fence across my driveway." "No," he replied calmly. "I built a fence on my property." I laughed because the alternative was impossible. "My garage is behind that fence." He shrugged. "Then I guess you'll have to find another way home." At that moment, I still believed the misunderstanding would be cleared up in minutes. I had no idea I wouldn't drive into my own garage again for nearly 3 weeks. I pulled my phone from my pocket and called a non-emergency police line. 40 minutes later, Officer Melissa Grant stepped out of her patrol car while another officer walked around the fence, taking notes and looking at both properties. Richard never looked nervous. In fact, he seemed almost entertained. "Evening, officers," he said cheerfully. "Glad you're here. Maybe you can explain to my neighbor that property rights still matter." Officer Grant turned toward me. "Sir, what's happening?" I explained everything from the beginning. I had left for work before sunrise. My driveway had been completely open. Now a brand new fence blocked the only vehicle access to my garage. Richard calmly handed over a folder. "I've got copies of my property documents." The officers looked through the paperwork for several minutes before exchanging uncertain glances. Finally, Officer Grant sighed. "I'm afraid this appears to be a civil property dispute. We can't order either party to remove a permanent structure without a court order or official property determination." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. So he could just block my driveway? I'm saying we can't decide whose land this is. Richard folded his arms and smiled. I told you. The officers advised both of us to remain respectful, avoid damaging each other's property, and contact the county if the boundary was disputed. Then they left. The moment the patrol cars disappeared around the corner, Richard looked directly at me. You should probably start parking on the street. His confidence bothered me more than the fence itself. Most people bluff. Most people become defensive when police arrive. Richard acted like he'd already seen the ending. Over the next several days, nothing changed. Every morning, I parked nearly half a mile away because the nearest legal parking space stayed full before sunrise. Every evening, I carried groceries, toolboxes, and work equipment back to my house while my truck sat blocks away. Almost every time, Richard happened to be outside, watering flowers, checking his mailbox, sweeping an already clean driveway, always watching, always smiling. One Saturday morning, I walked over again, hoping calm conversation would accomplish more than anger. Richard, I said evenly, if there's honestly been a mistake, let's hire a surveyor together. He chuckled. You can hire 10 surveyors if you want. His answer caught me completely off guard. You already know what they'll find, he continued. That's why I'm not worried. Then he turned around and walked back inside without another word. Standing there alone, I realized something that sent a chill down my spine. Richard wasn't guessing. Somehow, he believed he already knew exactly where the property line was. By Monday morning, I'd accepted one uncomfortable truth. Arguing with Richard wasn't going to solve anything. If I wanted my driveway back, I needed facts, not opinions. Before work, I drove to the Franklin County Recorder's office downtown. The building smelled faintly of old paper and polished wood, the kind of place where decades of property history quietly sat inside filing cabinets and digital archives. A clerk named Denise greeted me with an understanding smile after I explained the situation. You'd be surprised how often fence disputes end up here, she said. Let's start with your deed. Within minutes, she pulled up records for both properties. At first, everything appeared straightforward. My deed listed the lot dimensions. Richard's deed listed his. Nothing immediately explained why a fence suddenly cut across the middle of my driveway. Denise suggested I request the original subdivision plat instead of relying only on modern records. About 20 minutes later, she returned carrying a large rolled document protected inside a clear archival sleeve. This, she said carefully, is the subdivision map filed when Maple Ridge Estates was first developed back in 1988. She spread it across a large viewing table. Every lot, every utility easement, every recorded property corner, everything had been drawn by hand with remarkable precision. I leaned closer. Something immediately caught my attention. The original plat showed my driveway entirely inside my property's boundary, exactly as I'd always believed. But when Denise compared it with the county's newer digital mapping system, the property line appeared shifted several feet. Not dramatically, just enough to create confusion. That's strange, I muttered. She frowned. Digital parcel maps aren't legal surveys. They're not. She shook her head. They're useful references, but they aren't guaranteed to match original field measurements. Courts usually rely on recorded deeds and licensed surveys, especially when original monuments still exist. Original monuments. The phrase stayed with me. I made copies of everything. My deed, Richard's deed, the original subdivision plat, historical aerial photographs dating back nearly 30 years. Before leaving, I asked one final question. If these maps don't agree, I said, how does anyone prove where the property line actually is? Denise smiled politely. You don't prove it with paper alone. Then how? You find the original survey monuments that were placed in the ground when the neighborhood was built. Walking back to my truck, I looked again at the stack of documents under my arm. Instead of giving me answers, they'd handed me a much bigger mystery. Somewhere beneath our quiet neighborhood, the real property line was still waiting to be found. By the second week, the fence had become more than an inconvenience. It had become part of my daily routine. Every morning, I left my house 40 minutes earlier than usual because my truck was parked 4 blocks away on the nearest street with unrestricted parking. I carry my laptop bag, lunch cooler, and work boots through rain, heat, and whatever Ohio decided to throw at me that day. Every evening, I made the same walk back. Neighbors noticed. Some offered sympathetic smiles. Others looked away, clearly uncomfortable. No one wanted to get involved. I couldn't really blame them. Property disputes had a way of turning friendly streets into uncomfortable places. The hardest part wasn't the walking. It was Richard. He somehow managed to appear outside almost every time I arrived home. If I carried groceries, he was trimming his hedges. If I hauled motorcycle parts, he was washing his pickup. If I simply walked by empty-handed, he was sitting on his porch with a glass of iced tea. He never shouted, never threatened me, never crossed the line into harassment. He didn't have to. His smug smile did all the talking. One afternoon, I struggled to carry several heavy boxes of construction reports from my truck after a long day at work. Halfway home, one box slipped from my arms, scattering folders across the sidewalk. Before I could kneel to pick them up, Richard's voice drifted across the street. "Looks like that garage isn't very useful these days." A few nearby neighbors heard him. No one laughed. The silence somehow felt worse. I calmly gathered my papers without answering. Inside, though, I was furious. Every instinct told me to tear that fence down with my own hands. One swing of a sledgehammer would solve the problem in minutes. But another voice inside my head reminded me why I couldn't. The moment I damaged his property, no matter how unfair the situation felt, I'd hand him exactly what he wanted. He could paint me as the unreasonable neighbor. Everything I'd built would disappear. So I did nothing. Instead, I documented everything. Every photograph, every conversation. Every day, my driveway remained blocked. Every receipt showing where I had to park. Every extra expense. Every inconvenience. If this eventually reached court, emotions wouldn't matter. Evidence would. Late one evening, as I stood in my front yard staring at the fence, an elderly man from 3 houses down slowly approached with the help of a wooden cane. "I've been watching this unfold," he said quietly. Then he looked at the fence and added something that immediately caught my attention. "You know, I remember where the original survey stakes used to be." The elderly man introduced himself as Walter Hansen. I'd seen him around the neighborhood for years, usually tending to the roses in his front yard or walking slowly to the mailbox with his golden retriever before the dog had passed away. We'd exchanged friendly waves, but we'd never really talked. "I'm 81, he said with a faint smile. "Been living on this street since they finished building these houses." That immediately got my attention. "You were here from the beginning?" He nodded. "Bought this place in 1988. Back then, there weren't any trees. No fences either. Just fresh concrete, young families, and a whole lot of mud." He looked toward the fence blocking my driveway. "That's why this doesn't sit right with me." I walked over, eager to hear more. Walter leaned on his cane and pointed toward the front corner of my yard. When the developers finished surveying the lots, they placed brass property markers at every corner. Survey crews were all over this neighborhood for weeks. "You actually remember them?" "I do. Kids kept finding them while playing. Their parents would tell them not to touch those little brass caps because they marked the legal property corners." I glanced toward my lawn. "I've never seen anything like that." "You wouldn't," Walter replied. "Most disappeared under grass after a few years. Then people planted bushes, poured decorative landscaping, added flower beds. Eventually, everyone forgot they were there." He paused for a moment, thinking. "I remember one marker in particular." "Where?" He slowly pointed toward the edge of my driveway, near an old maple tree. "Right about there." I followed his finger. Today, the area was covered by thick mulch, decorative stone, and years of overgrown shrubs. Nothing suggested any kind of survey marker lay underneath. Walter continued. "Back then, the surveyors measured everything from those brass monuments. They didn't care where someone wanted a fence. They cared where those markers Saturday." The words instantly reminded me of what Denise at the recorder's office had said. Original monuments. Not digital maps. Not assumptions. Original monuments. "I can't swear it's still there," Walter admitted. "Maybe construction covered it. Maybe landscaping buried it. But I bet my pension it wasn't removed." Hope slowly replaced the frustration I'd carried for nearly 2 weeks. For the first time since the fence went up, I felt like I wasn't chasing rumors anymore. I finally had a direction. As Walter turned to leave, he smiled. If that marker's still in the ground, he said quietly, the truth's been waiting there longer than either of you have owned those houses. The next morning, I stopped trying to solve the problem myself. Walter's story had given me hope, but hope wasn't evidence. I needed someone whose opinion actually carried legal weight. Before leaving for work, I searched for licensed land surveyors in Franklin County and called 3 different companies. The first 2 couldn't schedule anyone for nearly a month. The third call changed everything. Summit Land Surveying, a calm voice answered. I explained the situation from beginning to end. When I finished, the man on the phone said, "I'm Michael Bennett, licensed professional surveyor. I've handled dozens of boundary disputes over the years. We can come out Thursday morning." That was only 2 days away. For the first time in weeks, I felt like something was finally moving forward. Thursday arrived with clear skies and cool morning air. At exactly 8 o'clock, a white pickup truck pulled into the street with Summit Land Surveying printed across both doors. Michael stepped out carrying a weathered leather field book while 2 technicians unloaded bright orange tripods, measuring rods, metal detectors, and GPS equipment from the truck. He looked to be in his late 50s, with gray hair tucked beneath a faded baseball cap and the calm confidence of someone who had spent decades solving problems that couldn't be argued away. After shaking my hand, he looked toward the fence. "So," he said, "that's the famous driveway. I'm hoping you can tell me who's right." He smiled politely. "My job isn't to decide who's right." I frowned. "It isn't." "No." He knelt and brushed a hand across the concrete near the driveway entrance. "My job is to determine where the legal boundary exists based on recorded deeds and original survey evidence." He stood again. "A lot of people think fences determine property lines. They don't. Not necessarily. What about county maps? They're helpful references, but they're not the final authority." I remember Denise saying almost the exact same thing. Michael continued, "If the original survey monuments still exist, they're usually the strongest evidence available." Original monuments. There was that phrase again. Richard walked outside, just then, coffee mug in hand, watching the equipment being unloaded. He smirked. "Wasting your money," he called across the yard. Michael didn't even look up. Instead, he quietly opened his field notebook. "People can argue over fences all day," he said to me, "but steel monuments buried in the ground don't have opinions." For the first time since this nightmare had started, I realized I wasn't hiring someone to support my side. I was hiring someone whose only loyalty was to the truth. Michael's crew didn't rush. That surprised me. I'd imagined surveying meant setting up a GPS unit, pressing a few buttons, and getting an instant answer. Instead, every movement seemed deliberate. One technician stretched a measuring tape along the sidewalk, while another marked reference points with bright orange flags. Michael stood quietly studying the original subdivision plat beside his weathered field book, occasionally comparing handwritten measurements with numbers on a tablet. Nothing looked dramatic. It looked methodical. After nearly an hour, they hadn't even come close to my driveway. I finally walked over. "Are we making progress?" Michael smiled without looking up. "We're establishing control." "What does that mean?" "It means we don't guess." He pointed toward a metal pin they had uncovered at the corner of another property nearly 2 houses away. "Every reliable measurement starts from something we know is correct. Only then do we work our way toward what we're trying to prove." It made perfect sense. As an engineer, I knew shortcuts created mistakes. Still, patience was becoming difficult. Across the street, Richard leaned comfortably against his mailbox, sipping coffee as though he were watching free entertainment. Around lunchtime, he wandered closer. "You boys find Atlantis yet?" he joked. Neither technician responded. Michael simply kept writing notes. Richard laughed. I told him he was wasting his money. Michael finally looked up. "We're not here to prove anyone right." Richard grinned. "Good. We're here to measure." Without another word, Michael returned to his work. Richard's smile faded for only a second before he walked back across the street. The afternoon passed slowly. The technicians swept metal detectors across flower beds, around shrubs, beside sidewalks, and near the edge of my driveway. Most of the signals turned out to be old nails, irrigation hardware, soda cans, and forgotten landscaping spikes buried over decades. Each time the detector beeped, my hopes rose. Each time it wasn't the survey marker, they fell again. By nearly 5 o'clock, long shadows stretched across the neighborhood. Even I began wondering whether Walter's memory had been wrong. One technician, a younger man named Luis, knelt beside the old maple tree at the edge of my driveway. "This mulch is unusually deep," he said. He carefully pulled back decorative stones before digging through compacted soil with a narrow hand trowel. A sharp metallic sound echoed against the blade. Clink! Everyone froze. Luis brushed away another thin layer of dirt. Then another. Slowly, the top of a small circular brass disc emerged from the ground. Michael walked over, crouched beside it, and for the first time all day, I saw him smile. For several seconds, nobody said a word. Michael knelt beside the small brass disc, gently brushing away the remaining dirt with a soft nylon brush instead of his hands. Years of packed soil slowly gave way, revealing worn lettering stamped into the metal. The top read, "Franklin County Survey Monument." Below, it was a survey registration number that had nearly disappeared beneath decades of corrosion. Michael nodded quietly. "That's an original monument." I felt my heart pounding. "So this is it?" "It might be." He looked at Luis. "Don't disturb it." Luis immediately stepped back. Michael opened his field notebook and carefully compared the monument number with the original subdivision plat Walter had helped point us toward. Then he entered several measurements into his data collector before setting up a total station directly over the brass marker. The machine rotated silently, while another technician positioned a prism farther down the property line. Numbers flashed across the screen. Distances, angles, coordinates. Everything was checked once, then checked again. Richard finally wandered across the street, forcing a laugh that sounded less confident than earlier. "So?" Michael didn't answer immediately. He finished another set of calculations before standing up. Instead of looking at me, he walked directly toward Richard. "Mr. Dawson?" Richard folded his arms. "Yeah." Michael held up a copy of the original subdivision plat. "I have a simple question." Richard shrugged. "Shoot. When you hired the contractor to build this fence," he paused just long enough for everyone watching from nearby yards to grow completely silent. "Did anyone verify the property corners using the original survey monuments?" Richard blinked. "My contractor measured everything." Michael nodded politely. "I didn't ask about the contractor." Richard's expression tightened. "I asked whether anyone located the original monument before construction." Richard glanced toward the fence, then back at Michael. "I don't know." Michael smiled. It wasn't a mocking smile. It was the calm smile of someone who had just found the answer he'd been searching for all day. "I thought so." Richard shifted his weight for the first time since this dispute began. "So what does that mean?" Michael closed his notebook. "It means we're not finished." His voice remained calm. "We still have to verify every boundary point before I issue a certified survey." Richard tried to laugh again. "So nothing's official?" "Not yet, but I'll tell you this." Michael looked once more at the brass monument buried beneath the maple tree. Original survey monuments rarely tell different stories. He gathered his equipment and turned toward his crew. "We'll finish the remaining measurements tomorrow morning." As Richard walked back toward his house, his confident stride had disappeared. And for the very first time in nearly 3 weeks, he stopped smiling first. "I barely slept that night." For the first time since Richard built the fence, I felt hope pushing back against frustration. Still, I refused to celebrate too early. Michael had been clear. Nothing mattered until the measurements were complete. At exactly 8 o'clock the next morning, the Summit Land Surveying truck rolled back onto Maple Ridge Drive. This time, Richard was already outside. No coffee, no smile, just crossed arms and an expression that looked more impatient than confident. Michael greeted his crew, then walked straight to the brass monument beneath the maple tree. "Let's verify every corner," he said. The next 4 hours were unlike anything I'd ever seen. The technicians worked from one monument to another, stretching precise measurements across multiple properties instead of focusing only on mine. Every reading was recorded. Every angle was checked. Every distance was calculated twice. At one point, Michael even asked permission from two neighboring homeowners to access the corners of their backyards. Both agreed immediately. Richard watched every move. Around noon, another vehicle pulled onto the street. It carried the logo of the Franklin County Engineering Office. A county survey specialist stepped out and introduced herself as Karen Ellis. Richard looked surprised. "I thought you already had surveyors." Michael nodded. "We do." Karen smiled politely. "But when a boundary dispute may require official county action, independent verification is the best practice." She wasn't there to replace Michael. She was there to confirm his work. Richard's confidence slipped another notch. Karen reviewed Michael's field notes before conducting her own measurements using completely separate equipment. She didn't ask him for numbers. She generated her own. For nearly 2 hours, both survey teams worked independently. Neither spoke much. Neither offered opinions. Only numbers. Only measurements. Finally, Karen walked over to Michael. The two compared their completed calculations in silence. Neither looked surprised. Karen extended her hand. Exact match. Michael shook it. Within less than 1/10 of an inch. As an engineer, I knew how remarkable that was. Independent surveys rarely matched perfectly unless the evidence was incredibly strong. Richard stepped forward. "So what does that prove?" Karen turned toward him calmly. "It proves both surveys identified the same legal property boundary." He swallowed. "My fence." She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she pointed toward the original brass monument beside my driveway. "That monument established this subdivision decades before either of you lived here." Then she looked directly at the fence blocking my garage. "Our measurements indicate the structure wasn't built on the legal boundary." Richard stared at the fence without saying a word. For the second time in 2 days, someone else smiled. This time, it wasn't Michael. It was the county surveyor. Karen asked both of us to gather near the edge of my driveway. Michael laid the original subdivision plat across the hood of his truck, while Karen opened a digital map on her tablet. At first glance, the two looked almost identical. Almost. Karen pointed to the digital parcel map. "This is the version most homeowners see online." Then she tapped the original plat. "This is the legally recorded subdivision survey." Richard frowned. "They're different." "Only slightly," she replied. "But in boundary disputes, a few feet can make all the difference." Michael picked up a measuring rod and walked toward the fence. He stopped beside one of the freshly installed posts. "This fence," he explained, "appears to have been built using an existing landscape edge as the property reference." Richard immediately answered, "That's where the old fence used to be." Michael nodded. "I believe you." Richard looked relieved for a moment. But the old fence wasn't built on the legal boundary either. The relief disappeared from Richard's face. Karen stepped in. We reviewed aerial photographs from multiple years. She pulled several images onto her tablet. The oldest photo showed the neighborhood shortly after construction. No fences, only freshly graded lots. The second image, taken years later, showed a short decorative split rail fence running several feet away from the true boundary. It wasn't intended as a legal property marker, Karen explained. It was landscaping. Michael continued. At some point, someone assumed that decorative fence represented the actual lot line. Then future owners repeated the same assumption. Richard stared silently at the photographs. "I bought the house with that fence already there." "I understand," Karen said gently. "That happens more often than people realize." She looked toward me. "It doesn't mean anyone intentionally created the mistake." Then she turned back to Richard. "But replacing an old fence without verifying the original survey monuments also doesn't make the mistake legally correct. The neighborhood had unknowingly relied on an incorrect visual reference for years. One assumption became another, then another. Eventually, everyone simply accepted it as fact, until someone buried beneath mulch and decorative stone quietly proved otherwise." Michael folded the subdivision plat. The original monument never moved. He looked directly at Richard. People did. The street fell completely silent. Even neighbors watching from their porches seemed to understand what had just happened. The problem had never been hidden paperwork. It had never been complicated legal language. It had been something far simpler. For years, everyone had trusted an old fence more than the ground beneath their feet. And that single assumption had finally caught up with it. The change in Richard was almost immediate. Just 24 hours earlier, he'd stood in his yard like a man who believed the neighborhood belonged to him. Now he avoided eye contact. The county survey crew packed their equipment and drove away, leaving behind only small orange flags marking the confirmed property corners. As I walked toward my front door, Richard called after me. "Ethan." I turned. "Can we talk?" For the first time since this whole nightmare began, his voice carried no sarcasm, no confidence, just uncertainty. I walked over but stopped several feet away. "What is it?" He rubbed the back of his neck before speaking. "Maybe we got off on the wrong foot." I didn't answer. He continued. "I honestly thought the fence was on my property." "I believe you." He looked surprised by my response. "I do," I said calmly. "I don't think you woke up one morning planning to block my driveway." "Exactly. But you still built it without verifying the boundary." His shoulders dropped. "I trusted the contractor. I trusted the old fence. I trusted what the previous owner told me." I nodded. "And now we know all of those were wrong." For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Finally, Richard sighed. "What if I moved the fence myself?" I looked at him carefully. "The county hasn't finished its process." "I know, so let's not make anything worse." He hesitated before lowering his voice. "What if we just forget the surveys?" I frowned. "What do you mean?" "I'll move the fence. You keep using the driveway. We don't involve lawyers. No complaints. No reports. We shake hands and move on." The proposal sounded reasonable. Almost. But something about it didn't sit right with me. If the county already documented everything, I asked, how would pretending it never happened solve anything? Richard looked away. It might keep this from becoming official. There it was. This wasn't about fixing the mistake. It was about avoiding the consequences. I folded my arms. "I'm not interested in punishing you." "I know. I'm interested in doing this the right way." His expression hardened slightly. "So you're taking this all the way?" "I'm letting the process finish. Nothing more. Nothing less." He nodded slowly. "I was hoping you'd say something different." "I know." As I turned toward my house, Richard called one last time. "Ethan." I looked back. "I'm sorry." The words sounded genuine. Maybe they were. But apologies couldn't erase weeks of frustration, blocked access to my home, or the evidence already sitting in county files. Some problems could be forgiven. Others simply had to be corrected. And this one had reached the point where only the proper process could bring it to an end. 3 days after the surveys were completed, I received a call from Karen Ellis. "Mr. Parker," she said, "the county has finished reviewing both survey reports. We'll be conducting a formal site inspection tomorrow morning. Do I need to do anything? Just be available if we have questions." That was it. No drama. No promises. Just another step in the process. At 9 o'clock the following morning, 2 county vehicles pulled onto Maple Ridge Drive. Karen arrived with another official from the county's zoning and property compliance office named David Morales. Richard was already outside before they even stepped out of their vehicles. He looked exhausted. The confidence that had once seemed impossible to shake had completely disappeared. David introduced himself before opening a thick folder. "We're here to document the confirmed boundary and inspect the reported encroachment." Everything they did felt organized. Photographs, measurements, notes. Every fence post received a number marker. Karen compared each measurement against the certified survey, while David photographed every angle from the sidewalk, driveway, and neighboring lots. No opinions were exchanged. Only facts. Richard finally broke the silence. "So, what happens now?" David closed his notebook. "Based on the certified survey, the fence extends beyond your legal property boundary." Richard swallowed. "So I have to move it." "We'll be issuing a formal notice requiring the encroachment to be corrected." "How long do I have?" "You'll receive the official timeline in writing." Richard nodded quietly. There was no argument, no raised voice, no attempt to blame anyone else. Just quiet acceptance. Karen walked over to me. "I know this has been frustrating." "It has. You handled it the right way." I smiled. "There are moments I want to tear the whole fence down myself." She laughed softly. "I'm glad you didn't." "So am I." She looked back toward the orange survey flags. When people follow the legal process, everyone knows exactly where they stand. Before leaving, David handed Richard a sealed county envelope. I recommend reading this carefully. Richard thanked him without opening it. The county vehicles pulled away, leaving the street strangely quiet. That evening, I watched from my front window as Richard sat alone on his porch holding the unopened envelope for nearly an hour. He didn't call anyone. He didn't pace around the yard. He simply stared at the fence he'd been so certain was permanent. The next morning, a pickup truck from a local fencing company slowly pulled into his driveway. Two workers climbed out carrying tool bags and clipboards. One of them looked at the fence, then at the orange survey flags. Finally, he nodded once. Without saying a word, they began measuring every single fence panel. By 8 o'clock Saturday morning, half the neighborhood already knew something was happening. Pickup trucks from the fencing company lined the curb outside Richard's house. Workers unloaded pry bars, impact drivers, and stacks of wooden braces while bright orange safety cones appeared along the sidewalk. Nobody spoke much. They simply got to work. I stood quietly on my front porch with a mug of coffee, careful not to get in anyone's way. One by one, nearby neighbors wandered outside. Some pretended to walk their dogs. Others watered flower beds that probably didn't need watering. Everyone was curious. After weeks of watching the dispute unfold, they wanted to see how it ended. The crew leader unfolded a copy of the certified survey and compared it with the orange property flags still marking the legal boundary. He nodded toward Richard. "We'll remove everything beyond this line first." Richard simply answered, "Go ahead." His voice barely carried across the yard. The first screw came out with the sharp whine of an impact driver. Then another. Within minutes, the first fence panel was lifted free and carefully carried toward the truck. For the first time in nearly 3 weeks, I could see the entrance to my driveway beginning to reappear. It felt strangely unreal. I wasn't celebrating. I was simply watching something that should never have happened finally being corrected. The workers moved efficiently. Panel after panel disappeared. Concrete around several misplaced posts was broken apart with small demolition hammers before the posts themselves were lifted out of the ground. Dust drifted through the morning sunlight. Fresh cedar boards that had looked permanent only weeks earlier now lay stacked neatly on a trailer. Richard remained nearby the entire time. He didn't argue. He didn't complain. Whenever the crew asked a question, he quietly answered and stepped aside. Around midday, the last section blocking my driveway was removed. The crew swept away loose gravel and fragments of concrete before loading their final tools. For the first time since that Thursday evening, there was nothing standing between the street and my garage. The open stretch of concrete looked almost unfamiliar. I walked slowly down the driveway until I reached the garage door. For a moment, I simply stood there. Not because I'd won, because I had my home back. As I turned around, I noticed Walter standing across the street with his cane. He gave me a small nod. I smiled back. Neither of us needed to say anything. Sometimes the quietest victories were the ones that meant the most. I thought the story was over once the fence came down. I was wrong. The following Tuesday, Karen called again. "Mr. Parker, I'd like to stop by for a few minutes." "Is something wrong?" "Not exactly." Her answer was careful enough to make me curious. About an hour later, she arrived with David Morales. Neither of them looked concerned, but both carried the same folders they'd used during the inspection. Karen pointed toward the side of Richard's yard. "While documenting the fence removal, we noticed something unrelated to your original complaint." I followed her gaze. Richard's decorative stone retaining wall ran along one side of his property. Behind it sat a neatly landscaped garden with shrubs, flower beds, and a small wooden storage shed. "It looks normal to me," I admitted. David opened the certified survey. "It looks normal because everyone has assumed it's been in the correct location for years." He handed me a copy. The highlighted boundary line told a different story. The retaining wall didn't sit on Richard's property. Neither did part of the garden. Even one corner of the storage shed extended beyond the legal boundary. I stared at the drawing. "So, the fence wasn't the only problem?" Karen shook her head. "No. It appears several improvements were built using the same incorrect reference line." Richard stepped outside, just as we finished talking. The moment he saw Karen, his shoulders dropped. "I was wondering when you'd come back." She nodded politely. We completed our follow-up review. "I figured." David explained everything calmly, showing Richard the updated diagrams and measurements. Richard listened without interrupting. Finally, he sighed. "I honestly thought everything followed the old fence." "We believe you," Karen replied. "But the certified survey establishes the legal boundary." Richard looked toward the retaining wall he'd spent years building, then toward the small shed behind it. "So those two," David answered honestly. "They'll need to be addressed." Richard closed his eyes for a brief moment before nodding. "Understand." Watching him, I didn't feel satisfaction. I felt perspective. One incorrect assumption had quietly shaped years of landscaping, construction, and decisions. No one had questioned it until the driveway dispute forced everyone to look closer. Karen gathered her paperwork before leaving. "Property boundaries rarely change," she said. "What changes is people's understanding of them." As the county vehicles drove away, Richard remained standing silently beside his garden. For the first time since we'd become neighbors, neither of us saw an opponent. We simply saw two homeowners learning that the truth beneath the ground had been there all along, waiting patiently for someone willing to uncover it. A week later, every orange survey flag had been removed. The fencing company had finished relocating the remaining sections onto Richard's actual property, and the last construction truck disappeared from Maple Ridge Drive before noon. For the first time in nearly a month, my driveway looked exactly as it had the day I bought the house. Simple, open, mine. That evening, I left work a little earlier than usual. As I turned onto my street, I caught myself slowing down. Not because I had to, because part of me still expected to see that fence standing there. Instead, the entrance to my driveway was completely clear. I smiled without even realizing it. I pulled onto the concrete, drove past the maple tree where the brass monument had been discovered, and pressed the garage door opener. The familiar sound of the door rolling upward echoed through the quiet neighborhood. I parked inside, turned off the engine, and simply sat there for a moment. It wasn't about a driveway anymore. It was about coming home. When I stepped outside, I noticed Walter tending to his roses across the street. He raised a hand. "Feels good, doesn't it?" "It does." He walked over slowly with the help of his cane. "I've seen a lot of neighbors fight over property through the years," he said. "Most of them let anger make their decisions. I almost did, but you didn't." I looked toward the small brass survey monument, now protected by a flush utility cover installed after the county completed its work. "It's funny," I said. "That little piece of metal sat there for almost 40 years. Walter smiled. "It never moved." "No, we just stopped paying attention to it." He nodded knowingly before heading back home. A few minutes later, Richard stepped onto his porch. For a second, we looked at each other across the street. Then he gave a small nod. I returned it. There was no handshake, no dramatic speech. Some things didn't need either. The dispute was over. Life could finally move forward. Later that evening, I rolled one of my old motorcycles out of the garage and sat beside it with a cold glass of lemonade, watching the sunset settle over Maple Ridge Drive. The neighborhood felt peaceful again. Looking back, I realized the surveyor's smile had never been about proving someone wrong. It had been about finding something that had quietly existed beneath our feet the entire time. The truth hadn't changed. People's assumptions had. And sometimes, the strongest foundation isn't built from concrete or wood. It's built from patience, evidence, and the willingness to let facts speak louder than pride.